It is, whilst I've got that screen up, Grace, I'm unable to see any chat. So I'll presume you'll break in with any questions or the like, if there's any questions from the audience.
Will do.
Okay. Rightio. Okay, so you can see the screen. Volume of services to our members and impart knowledge and skills through events and special workshops, as noted there. Been in existence for 17 years now. We aim to deliver upwards of 20 events through these type of sessions, face-to-face sessions, other special workshops and other training type exercises. 1,300 strong in terms of LinkedIn members, and our formal chapter membership has nudged 300. It's been steadily on the rise over the last couple of years now. So we have certainly from one of the smaller chapters in Australia, we're certainly punching above our weight, and it's some good results there. One other announcement that I'd like to bring to your attention is again one of the got slides going jumping all over the place. Apologies. One of the special offerings and the training. Apologies for that. One of the training programs that we offer is the PMBOK and the PMP exam presentation. That we run annually. In fact, we aim to do that twice a year. So this next one's, I must have a timer on there. Sorry, guys. I'm not speaking quick enough. So course details are provided there. It's starting on the, when is it starting on? The 16th of June.
Tomorrow.
Okay, well, I don't have the date in front of me, but certainly click that hyperlink there. Details are provided. It is a very fair priced training course to assist you with the preparation to get through that certification. Okay, so moving right along, many of the events that we are able to provide are supported by our sponsors and partners, and we have listed the current range of sponsors and partners that we have had the pleasure of their support over the previous years, and just like to acknowledge SA Water, Paxis, BDO, Turner and Townsend, MFY, and PMO Oz, and always looking for other support through partnerships. And if there's any interest, we'll highlight the link at the end of the presentation how to get involved and provide services and support to our chapter. Okay, I think that's a formality. Before I hand over, you've got a fairly busy screen in front of you here. I've known Travis now for probably a couple of years, and it's taken about 12 months to get him to this event here tonight. And I suppose it's been COVID's probably played a big part of that, because he has been grounded at home in lockdown for as many months as we all have. Not doing the weekly commutes to the eastern states to provide the expert services that he provides to many corporates and senior executives. I'm not even going to try and pronounce all those postgraduate nominals there after his name there, but as you can see, very well credentialed, very experienced individual who's has a core focus on consulting, organisation and coaching background of executive leadership and advisory. as noted down there, he's certainly recognised by his peers locally and internationally. Over 30 years' experience working at the board and the C level and teams across the NYSE and the Australian Stock Exchange. And I can read the rest of it, but I'm sure you're doing so likewise. I've just highlighted the that last point there is his work focuses on identifying, developing and optimising performance of individual leaders, their teams and their enterprises. And a lot of what I'm sure Travis will share with us tonight will certainly be of interest to all of us in the project industries to obviously consider, take on board as we get through this situation and look at new ways of working and managing our teams and our change programs going forward. So on that note, Travis, I'm going to hand over to you. And I was going to say that your photo doesn't quite resemble what you looked like yesterday, but obviously you've had a little bit of time to clean up, and I'm sure we're looking forward to an excellent presentation tonight. So over to you, Travis.
Thanks, Peter. You might have to put a bit of context around that. I was actually looking more like Ned Kelly yesterday, and my 11-year-old eventually got to the point that, Dad, that's enough. It needs to come off. And when my 11-year-old tells me that, I know it's time to come off. So thank you for that. For having me. It's a great privilege to be here. I'm looking forward to sharing as much information as I possibly can with you in 45 minutes. You'll probably feel overwhelmed and overloaded, and I don't apologise for that. There's an awful lot of stuff to talk about with regards to what's happening at the moment. And I'm going to start sharing my screen, if that's okay. But
thank you.
You'll have to stop sharing yours.
Okay. Done.
All righty. So, just let me see whether this one works. Now, I'm hoping everybody can see that. And if you can't, somebody will poke me electronically and let me know. I just wanted to fill you in a bit about my background. And it's interesting that Pete was describing my background briefly, but this is the way I see what I do. And this is a photo of me and some people that I've been working with in the past. And you can see I'm hoping that I'm the one that is second from the right. Why I think that and why I see myself that way is that I spend so much time in so many different industries and so many organisations wearing such different hats. Sometimes it's difficult to remember what my foundations and what my core is. So, I mean, in a nutshell, I'm a psychologist by trade. I haven't always been a psychologist. I started life as a teacher, believe it or not, and I was a physical education and outdoor education teacher. And one thing that has sort of stayed with me in my whole career to this point is the importance of understanding that humans learn, grow and develop. And throughout the span of a lifetime, they can change and morph themselves into very different beings as compared to what they were when they first started their journey. And for me personally, the joy and the excitement and associated with helping people and supporting people to grow and develop is the theme that has sort of continued through my career as I become a psychologist and then moved into business and then running businesses, growing businesses, starting businesses. I spend a lot of my time now in the tech startup space as an angel investor and a mentor. I still research and write in the area of coaching psychology and leadership. I'm still a part-time academic in an adjunct role at the University of South Australia in the business school. And believe it or not, 15 years ago, I was the MBA director before I resigned my tenured academic position at that point, much to the shock and horror of my colleagues at that point, to start my own business, and then eventually exited that business to the largest HR consulting firm in the world. And since then, I've been just following my passion in a number of different ways. But what ties all that together, I guess, is the fact that as a psychologist, I'm a scientist. I'm a behavioural scientist. And we've learned a lot and have researched intensely around human beings for the last 80, 90, 100 years. And we have some very, very solid evidence for how humans think, learn, grow, behave, feel, and how they show up in the world. And unfortunately, as we'll sort of touch on a little bit later on, the assumption that humans are rational and logical beings is a very unsafe assumption. That's not the world according to Dr. Trav, it's the world according to the evidence that supports our understanding of humans. So what I play around with in a lot is the unpleasant truths associated with what it means to be an irrational human being and how that plays out in organisations. And in particular, in the current context, how does it play out in crises that we haven't experienced before in its current form? And I'm not certainly going to labour the point that we live in unprecedented times, because if I hear somebody say we live in unprecedented times one more time, I think I'm going to just shoot myself. Yes, there are very challenging times that we're experiencing at the moment. We have experienced challenging times in the past. Humanity has experienced far greater challenging times in history, and this is the latest iteration. So looking at how we respond to those sorts of situations, how we engage with each other, how we come through the other end, and what we look at and look like when we come out the other end is a very interesting part for me to sort of reflect on. Some of the ideas I want to share very quickly and briefly, as I said, I want to pack in as much as I can. In particular, how the world has already changed forever, but before COVID, and how we're still struggling to really believe it and come to terms with it. And whilst COVID has been a real catalyst for understanding that, you know, life isn't as predictable and nice and comfortable and linear as we might think, the world has been changing markedly over the last 15 to 20 years, technologically and socially. I just want to touch on that because there's some amazing sort of thinkers that have worked in this space whose predictions around how organisations and individuals within them are morphing have been incredibly accurate. What we've known for a long time about humans and why it's suddenly so new, as I said before, we've known a lot about how humans learn, grow, develop, change, behave, think, and interact with each other. And we tend not to rely on that data. In fact, we tend to overlook that data quite often in organisations. It's a very unsafe practice to continue to do that. And I'll talk to you a little bit about why we should embrace that more now than ever. How meaning, values, and beliefs are aligned to sustainability, engagement, and performance. When we start to look at human performance in organisations, we tend, and we have tended in the past, to focus on very different factors than what we're starting to focus on now. I want to share some of those. Some would argue that we're witnessing live time, the death of individualistic capitalism, and the way that I guess we've structured our enterprise systems in relation to that pursuit is causing organisations a lot of pain and suffering in this particular event. Why the industrial hierarchy has fallen apart is another interesting question. And you know, quite often we talk about hierarchies in organisations and chains of command. And yet what we're seeing now, especially with the younger people coming through the system, they're not interested in complying with a hierarchy. They're not interested in being a part of an organisation that has directive control. And as a result, they're basically voting with their feet. And we're seeing a whole bunch of things that are making that problematic for organisations. I want to talk a little bit about trust and how that's a foundational platform for everything from here. We talk in the leadership space a lot about the importance of trust. And it's a very easy topic to sort of mention quickly, acknowledge that it's important, and move on. What we've discovered in this process, and what we will continue to discover in organisations, is that trust is the essence of everything in human relationships, and organisations are nothing more than a series of human relationships. And if you're in the commercial property business, for example, or you're in the construction business for commercial property, those industries are suffering, and they will continue to suffer as humans start to decide that they don't actually need to cohabitate with each other for 8 hours a day in an office building. And so there will be flow-on crises from these events that will take decades to work through the system and for us to redesign our organisations, as we already are now currently. But this has accentuated the speed of that redesign. We will start to see some pain points surface. So there's a couple of other things that play out of that. You know, this notion of introversion and extroversion has come up a lot with my clients in relation to working in isolation. A lot of mythology around introversion and extroversion, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The real pandemic that I'm facing now in my clients, but also in the broader context of social relationships is a bubble of mental illness that will work its way through the system now. Already, as the constraints and the restrictions are starting to come off, we're seeing an uplift in anxiety disorders surfacing. We're seeing people who don't want to go back to the workforce or to the workplace, because they don't want to leave their homes because of the anxiety associated with leaving, and the ongoing anxiety about the impacts of the virus itself and its consequences to many. So the myth of business as usual, whilst it's being, I guess, spoken about more and more as these restrictions come off, business as usual doesn't exist. We will not go back to business as usual. We will certainly be moving towards a new business style and model. One of the things that has brought that about is the realization that for a lot of people over the last 30 years in organizations, we've been boiling frogs. And this pandemic in some regards has enabled us to realize that the heat's been turned up to the point where our productivity, our functionality, our mental health and well-being, our sustainability, our health and well-being as humans have been compromised fundamentally. And what we're seeing is that this notion of perpetual growth, perpetual performance, sustaining competitive advantage through ever-increasing growth and performance improvement is not a sustainable system. So we start to come down to this realization of a linear growth path being an artificial construction for humans, and the evidence to support that perpetual growth is very light on. And in fact, the negative effects of trying to strive for that as human beings are starting to outweigh the possible benefits of attempting to strive for it. And I'll show you some data in a little while about the consequences to human beings as they continually strive for perpetually increasing and expanding goals. It's not a good mental health outcome. So the world has changed fundamentally already. And when you start to look at the speed of change, you start to see that this is a far from linear process from this point. And when you start to look at the curve of technology change, you can very quickly see that we're on an exponential curve. We're not on a linear curve. We're not on a curvilinear curve even. And that technological change over the last 10 to 15 years has accelerated rapidly. So if you were to position ourselves on that technological change curve, we haven't even got to the exponential point at this point in time. And yet our social, business and political systems are struggling to keep up with it. And there's a number of people who have been very active in this area, who are very accurate in terms of their ability to be able to predict at one level the speed and magnitude of those changes. This is one of those guys. So this is a pretty spectacular person. He's currently a director at Google. He's there, I guess, because it's an interesting thing for him to do, but he's an accomplished scientist. He's an accomplished futurist, and you may have come across him in your path. His name's Ray Kurzweil. He wrote a pretty significant book about 10 years ago now called The Singularity is Near, where he predicted the point at which biology and technology would merge seamlessly, and we would start to redefine the human condition, if that makes sense. The reason why this is important is because things are already changing, and this pandemic has highlighted the need to calibrate that speed of change and move with it to a degree and a speed which we haven't necessarily up until this point. So Ray is a pretty accurate guy. He's been accurate about 83% of the time in terms of his predictions over the last 30 to 40 years. And these are some of the predictions that he's sitting on at the moment by the 2020s. And we're in the 2020, we're in the 20s now. Most diseases will disappear as nanobots become smarter than current medical technology. That technology currently exists. Nanobot production is occurring as we speak, and the potential for nanobots to be able to be injected into humans and perform functions that we could only ever have dreamed of a half dozen years ago is in process now. About 6 months ago, we successfully implanted a CPU in a mouse, and we can now basically control the mouse's behavior through that CPU interface. This will become increasingly more common. Self-driving cars begin to take over the roads. We're in that process now. One of the big challenges with humans, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a sec, is this wonderful thing called belief perseverance. And Belief perseverance is the social and cognitive bias that we suffer that has us hold on to beliefs once we've landed on them as being true, even in the face of contrary evidence. And self-driving cars are a really interesting developmental phenomenon for humans because the evidence is very, very clear that within the next handful of years, and even now to some degree, the safety involved in a self-driving autonomous vehicle at least equals a fallible human and their complex and irrational decision-making when they're on the road. And yet we still continue to believe and hold the belief that humans will always be better at basically driving cars than what technology will be. It's a very interesting challenge that we as humans have to overcome as we move into the next sort of phase of growth and development. By the 2030s, virtual reality begin to feel 100% real. We're all in the process of accelerating that growth of technology in virtual reality at the moment, and we're seeing massive steps forward very quickly. By the end of the 2030s, we'll be able to upload our mind and our consciousness to the web. This is where it starts to become confronting for a lot of humans. It starts to become science fiction. It starts to trigger that anxiety associated with what that might mean, to the point where I start to reject it. And remember that as human beings, we're very dodgy at being able to pick what is good evidence and what is bad evidence. And there's no shortage of examples of that. And Ray Kurzweil would argue, and has argued very strongly, that by the end of the 2030s, this notion of immortality will be technologically possible. He would argue that I will be able to upload myself in some sort of form to a collective web that enables me to achieve longevity ad infinitum. And he would argue also that my 11-year-old, who I was talking about before, is the last generation, if they choose to, that ever has to die. So by the 2040s, our non-biological intelligence will be 1 billion times more capable than biological intelligence. And by 2045, we'll be able to multiply that intelligence 1 billion-fold. This is the singularity. This is amazing stuff in a lot of respects. So this is all happening at a time when the whole essence of what it means to be a human being is being challenged. It's starting to be challenged because we can see through this pandemic just how vulnerable we are. We can see the changing nature of biology and its fallibility and what that provides us in terms of threat to our biological system moving forward. So these are all important things for us to be thinking about. In terms of the way organisations have changed, we've already moved in organisations from a post-industrial paradigm to what Seth Godin, who is one of the world's leading marketers and social researchers, would suggest is a connection economy. He articulates very clearly the fact that bricks and mortar and the traditional post-industrial type organisation with its systems and hierarchies are no longer necessarily the driving force behind commerce. So these early adopters, these organisations that are understanding that, the technology startups, have spent a lot of time over the last 10 years in Google and have watched Google morph itself globally and locally in terms of its structure and function. Very interesting that the pandemic that we're currently experiencing has really started to challenge the functionality of these matrix type organisations. And the interesting observation in organisations like Google and others is that we're starting to see, I guess, a retraction, if you like, towards a more structured, more conservative type structure in terms of organisational structure, that is. And we're starting to see, as the revenue lines in some organisations start to, for the first time, come under a little bit of pressure, that we start to see a lot of post-industrial type behaviour start to emerge. But that's another sort of issue. Why is this specifically? What impact is this happening? Is this having on organisations? Well, the phenomenological evidence is really clear, and the quantitative evidence is emerging as well. Attraction and attention for organisations now of younger people and young professionals in particular is becoming more and more difficult. We're seeing mental health in organisations deteriorate. We're seeing creativity and innovation start to be challenged. And to provide some context to that, the way that our brains work physiologically and biologically, it's impossible to be able to be creative and innovative in terms of my cognition when I'm feeling at risk or under threat. So when humans start to feel anxiety and experience anxiety progressively more and more, their creativity and their innovation dips at the same rate as their anxiety increases. So it's interesting that in a lot of organizations, and I've started to use the term anxious leadership, because there's a growing pressure on organizations to continue their perpetual linear growth. Again, with no evidence to suggest that that's actually achievable or supportable, but the expectation still sits there. And as that expectation continues to become harder and harder to fulfill, the level of anxiety in organizations is increased to the point where we're starting to see anxious leadership more broadly. So this notion of sustainability and performance is suffering. Another one of the hats that I wear is as an exercise and sports psychologist, and working with high-performing athletes. It's a very interesting perspective that can be drawn upon and applied to organisations. When we work with high-performing athletes, if we were to expect them to perpetually improve their performance, if we would expect them to increase linearly their output regularly and perpetually, their performance would suffer very, very quickly and they'd burn out. And in fact, that's in the past what athletes who have strived for excellence have suffered from. When we're working with athletes these days, we're much more attentive to the amount of time they spend resting, for example, rather than performing. The amount of time they spend mentally rehearsing rather than physically training. So our whole notion of maintaining perpetual peak performance has shifted fundamentally. And as an organisational leader, I need to be starting to get my head around the fact that performance is far from a perpetual and linear process. It revolves around a series of high points, low points, and midpoints. It's a wave, it's a cycle, like everything else is in the universe. And if I'm going to continue to push to maintain a peak in that cycle, then there'll be catastrophic consequences to the individual and our organisations. Interestingly, when organisations that I work in, especially in the banking sector, the consulting sector, the accounting and finance sectors, anything up to 80% of employees in some organisations in some of those industries at the moment don't want to return to the office and are actively pushing back on going back into an office environment. That in and of itself tells you a lot about the social and the, I guess, the cultural aspect of what it means and what people are experiencing being in an organisation to be like. And the consequences, I guess, of continuing to push ourselves in line with those goals and to attain goals that are perpetually getting bigger and bigger is that depression starts to set in as what we would call an adaptive function to protect ourselves from ourselves. So some really interesting emergent data on how goal attainment and goal striving impacts on depression has surfaced. And it's very clear that when I perpetually achieve goals and then progressively set higher goals and move towards, again, perpetually achieving those, that over time, our bodies and our brains say, that's enough. You don't know how to drive us and look after us properly. I'll shut you down. And that's how the depression kicks in, if that makes sense. So what we're seeing in organisations, as I was saying before, increase in anxiety, but we're also seeing increase in depression, depressive episodes, and that holds true across broader culture as well, not just organisations, although it does tend to be a little bit higher in organisations. So, you know, these biases that we're facing, the biases that we grapple with every day are so important to start to grapple with as humans. And continuing to I guess, ignore them or to, I guess, downplay them is very dangerous, I think, for organisations to be doing at this point. And it's particularly dangerous for us as humans. So humans are funny things. They hear what they choose to hear, they see what they choose to see, and they believe what they choose to believe. And, you know, I'm sure that as you reflect on this cloud, there are things that you can see in that cloud that others may or may not see. And it's really interesting that my assumption that you're seeing what I'm seeing is a very unsafe assumption, because 9 times out of 10, what you're seeing is not exactly what I'm seeing at best. And in some cases, nothing like what you're seeing as well. So the assumption that we share the same views and that we share the same perspectives on problems and opportunities, for example, is a very unsafe assumption. That belief perseverance I spoke about before. There's things like confirmation bias. We persevere with beliefs about us being right or wrong or whatever we've landed on, even in the face of contradictory evidence. And perhaps the biggest challenge for humans is our tendency to be quite lazy in terms of the way we think. And there's a functional reason for that. Humans basically want to be making decisions about what's going to hurt them, what's going to be helpful to them, and am I at immediate and lethal risk. So we try and chunk data into very small bits, and we try and process that data very quickly, and we try and make it as accessible and meaningful as possible. But it leads to this wonderful thing called splitting, which humans have this, they're expert at, basically. They're probably no better than, they're the best at it of any species. And that splitting process is reducing complexity, if you like, to 2 states of being, a 0 or a 1, a left or a right or a wrong. And we as humans tend to want to land on one end of that spectrum or the other. So one of the big challenges in moving forward, especially in leading people, and I'm going to use that term when I'm talking about project management, leading people, because there is very little in some respects about management in leading people, and a lot about how I engage with people and how I help them, support them to learn, grow and be functional and perform. So as I start to separate myself from this irrational and biased view of splitting, and I separate those 2 points of right or wrong, left or right, black or white, then immediately when I separate those 2 points, I can create a continuum between those 2 points. And great project managers, great leaders, great people influencers are the ones that can separate those 2 extremes and operate on the spectrum that exists between them. They can move up and down that spectrum. They can be grey, and they accept and they understand that there is more grey than there is black and white. And I'm hoping that's making sense. It's very uncomfortable to move away from the point of being right or wrong. And in fact, most people really struggle when it comes to doubt being right or wrong, and they'll argue very strongly for their point of view. But we know that effectiveness in human systems, effectiveness in organizations, and certainly effectiveness in situations that are an immediate and significant threat, that the more that we can take in the complexity of the situation and play in the grey area, the better the outcome's going to be. Some of the other biases that we need to be aware of and start to manage, the false consensus effect, the tendency for people to overestimate the degree to which others agree with them. This is a really common one, very important to be aware of, very important to be acting against and noticing in yourself whenever you can. Most people may or may not actually agree with you. But the assumption that most people are agreeing with you is a very unsafe one. So testing that constantly is a vitally important part of effective project management and certainly leadership as well. Illusory correlation, the phenomenon of seeing the relationship one expects to see in a set of data, even when there's no such relationship. And this is very common in the sciences and more broadly as well. If I expect to see something, lo and behold, a lot of the time I will see it. It doesn't actually mean that it's there. It just means that I'm seeing it. And this is a very hard thing for humans to get their head around, because their belief is that they are very rational and they're just using quantitative evidence. And that is true to a point, but it's not an infallible system. Self-serving bias exists in organizations as well. The tendency to claim more responsibility for successes than failures. Now, there are many organizations that suffer from this and people within it. We've got many examples of leaders around the world who suffer from this and other more severe dysfunction, without naming too many names. But the tendency to claim more responsibility for my success than my failure is something that we need to be aware of and we need to act against. So the big question is, how do we know that we know what we think we know? And that's a really hard question to ask, and it's a very hard question to answer as well. And who says that anyway? Where's the evidence and where's the belief? So this is a good point, just to take a deep breath and sit back in your chair and let that sink in for a second. because there's an awful lot of information in there. There's an awful lot of question marks in there. There's an awful lot of uncertainty. There's an awful lot of complexity, and there's an awful lot of where are we going and what do we do from here? And that's an absolutely normal response to the situations that we're experiencing. And what we've discovered is that during those times, what is really valuable for people is for them to start to become mindful and start to draw inward and start to reflect on who they are as individuals. And what we're seeing more and more now in terms of leaders in organizations who are trying to navigate their way through complexity is that they're spending much more time introspecting. They're spending much more time looking at themselves first and foremost and understanding their own system, how they see the world, how they feel about it, how they think, and how they take in information, and really starting to get a handle on who they are as people. And lo and behold, what we're seeing in organisations now is when we start to talk about on an organisational wide level, the importance of our values as an organisation, and we start to create opportunities for people who are wanting to work in the organisation or who we want to work in our organisation to line up on the core values of that organisation, then we tend to get a better outcome. There's an alternative to, I guess, the traditional models of how we've thought we needed to manage organisations. There's an alternative now that is emerging that is much more evidence-based, for example, than what the hierarchy and directive autocratic control over organisations might have provided. Now, remember that in a post-industrial organisation, in an industrial organisation, in a military organisation, there is an absolute, immediate and pressing need for directive, controlling, autocratic hierarchies. Having been an army officer myself, there are times when if I gave an order, I didn't want a conversation about what you thought about the order, because the order was for purpose. And if we were in a combat situation, it really was dependent on, life or death, as opposed to opinion or preference. So there are places for directive, autocratic and controlling type leadership behaviour. And interestingly, some of the challenges that my leaders, my enterprise leaders of organisations, publicly listed and others have struggled with through the pandemic is that they've grown up in a leadership learning structure and curriculum, if you like, that is focused very much on empowering leadership and supportive leadership in leadership which is much more, I guess, self-driven as opposed to other-driven. And they've struggled with where to direct. They've struggled with where to be autocratic. They've struggled to provide clear, concise direction to people. They've struggled to articulate peace and calm and control in those sorts of situations. So it's interesting that we're starting to see that the importance of, leadership flexibility, behavioural flexibility, understanding situational variability for leadership has been incredibly important, and developing those skills is incredibly important as well. Having said that, we are still a long way away from developing insightful and self-aware leaders. So what tends to happen now in organisations as we struggle to build them, we're seeing organisations that are being built in response to market conditions that look like, rapid iterative prototyping in terms of the manufacturing process, as opposed to the traditional product development cycles. This notion of disintermediation, not only organisationally, but whole industries are being disintermediated. Uber Eats, Airbnb, all examples of disintermediators that have fundamentally changed industries. This notion of self-management becomes much more important. Me being the me incorporated, if you like, consultant to the organisation, and me driving my output, me being responsible for my own output, me being accountable for my own output. These are important things that are coming to the fore in terms of building effective teams and managing teams. Exposing the mythology around talent, performance, motivation and leadership. This notion of performance management, for example. The performance management cycle in most organisations revolves around a yearly come together, of a checklist against some rubbery KPIs or key performance indicators at best, and that basically captures feedback for the year. Those models and methods are still being used in a lot of conservative organisations, and yet the environment in which we're operating, the industries in which we're operating in a curvy linear world have moved on already. So this is going to require a little bit of change. This pandemic has highlighted the need for organisational change. It's also highlighted at one level how adaptable organisations are. So we've gone in a very short space of time, in a very narrow time frame, to a way of working that if I'd spoken to a lot of middle level managers 4 months ago, would have told me was absolutely ludicrous and impossible to have your whole workforce working remotely, self-directed, self-managing, would have been complete disaster and catastrophe. And yet we've managed to pull it off. We need to start to question those beliefs that we have about how people work, their values, their motivations, their integrity, how I can trust them, how I can't trust them. We need to be starting to challenge those stories very strongly, because when we start to look at the data that's falling out at the moment, even, we're seeing increases in health and well-being. We're spending less time in the organisation and being more autonomous. We're seeing better outputs. We're seeing more productive people, and we're seeing a more balanced and holistic sense of wellness around our workforce. So I'm not going to go into too much detail around the feedback process, because I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that this provides us an opportunity to look at what is really important in terms of how organisations function and operate within broader industries, but within themselves as well. And that process of looking at myself and really starting to understand myself at a very much deeper level, and starting to be accountable and self-managing in terms of how I need to show up, how I need to structure my life and the way that I work that's best for me so that I can be most productive, is going to be a critical element that we need to build in, not only to organisations, but individual projects, and negotiate that flexibility and that variability. So in an ideal world, for a lot of people, they will have a component of their work life that they spend in an office. This notion of introversion versus extroversion, again, is grotesquely oversimplified. We are all ambiverts. There's a bit of an introvert in us and there's a bit of an extrovert. And we sit on that continuum between those 2 points. I'm an extreme introvert. I've been sitting in this chair or another chair in my house now for 3.5 months. Even I need to get out and start to hang out with people a little bit more. Even I'm craving direct face-to-face human contact. So even the most extreme have the flip side that we need to start to recognize. So understanding yourself at that level even starts to enable you, once you've got the empowerment and the autonomy, and most importantly, as I was saying before, the trust that's granted to you by the people who you report to and the organizations in which you work, for me to be able to manage myself, manage my output, manage my contribution, and be accountable and responsible for producing what I've agreed to produce in this organization, is a vital shift in terms of the way we understand human enterprise and organizations. So what can we do as project managers to really help that along? It's not easy and it's going to feel uncomfortable, there's no question about that. But look for ways that you're wrong. We're very good at arriving at positions of rightness and then defending those positions. And as I said before, the joy and the opportunity, and I'm using positive words here, is how you're wrong. And the great learnings that occur lie in the mistake and the incorrectness. And yet we're hardwired as human beings, as we grow and develop, to push ourselves into that discomfort of being wrong and being ignorant less and less. And that's a real danger for our organisations and our future. In some respects, we need to drag ourselves back to childhood and start making a lot more mistakes. Let go of the illusion of control is a term that I use. Humans like to set up this illusion of control because it helps them feel safe. It helps them sort of alleviate their anxiety. There is very little controllable in our world, and I'm hoping that this pandemic is starting to educate people just as to the uncontrollability of our existence. Getting comfortable with the discomfort is a massively important leadership growth journey. And I would encourage people to do that. Get out of the way of your people. What we've seen in this is that when people are forced to adapt, and when they create their own ways of adapting and they can tap into what they're really passionate about, they produce and they contribute at levels far greater than what I even thought they were possible. So get out of the way and be courageous in getting out of the way. Embrace that dumbness, you know, understand my anxiety, start listening and asking, use those two things as my critical tools rather than talking and telling. And for so long in management models and in hierarchies, we've relied heavily on talking and telling and completely overlooked listening and asking. So persist with all this sort of stuff with patience. It's going to take some practice. Be kind to yourself. You're going to get it wrong a lot. The term that I've started to help people to get their head around is striving for what I would call imperfect leadership. Leaders are just people who are stepping up and doing the best they can. They're not perfect. There is no expectation that they're going to be perfect. Embrace the imperfection in your leadership and just get amongst it and show up. That's the key. So with that, I think I've run out of time. And what I would love to do, because you've probably got 1,000 questions, is to open the floor and I'll hand it over to the moderators.
Oh, thanks, Trev. It's look, I'm blown away with all those concepts and the terminology that you've shared with us tonight. I don't know whether I want to be working in the next 3 or 4 years, given what the 2020s are going to look like. In fact, well, I've probably got another 5 years in me. Who knows? But look, firstly, that was very insightful. Obviously well prepared. Obviously, you know, it's your bread and butter. And firstly, thanks for sharing some of those key messages. And I like the top 10 key points, those takeaway points for consideration. If I have one question, well, before I have one, Grace, I do see a couple here. Let me just see what we've got recorded.
Yeah, I've got those up on my screen. If you want me to grapple with those, Grace, what do you think? Shall I just pick a couple?
Perfect. Go ahead.
Is optimism wrong now? That's a great question. There's no question, there's been a bandwagon of optimism, of happiness, of positivity, of everything associated with the emergence of what we would call positive psychology. Again, come back to that notion of black, white, right, wrong, up and down. Positive psychology grew as a movement out of a position that was established in the US predominantly 50 or 60 years ago, that had the practice of psychology be fundamentally about mental illness and curing mental illness. Now, what we've discovered about humans is that, yes, at the extremes, we do still maintain a position of complex and quite often what we would call comorbid, multifactorial mental illness. Now, at the other end, and we would call that end, by the way, floundering. At the other end, we'd call that flourishing. And so this is when I'm at my best and when I'm balanced and I'm well and everything is ticking along. What we've discovered is that when we spend time focusing on what's working, when we spend time focusing on what we are aspiring towards, or what helps me be at my best, or what I'm grateful for example, all the positive elements of that, including optimism rather than pessimism, that we tend to enjoy a better level of wellness and health from a mental perspective. Now, the dilemma is that when we jump too far down to that end of the spectrum, that we rebalance the scales to the point where that in and of itself becomes dysfunctional as well. So we get what we would say is delusional optimism. So what we're trying to do is balance the scales constantly. So it's an excellent question. Optimism is very important. It's just a matter of balancing that with, you know, you choose the term, but realism or pessimism, if that makes sense. The technological exponential curve that we looked at, will it be the same speed post-COVID? I reckon it'll slow down for a few months and will normalise the next 2-3 years. Any thoughts? My gut feeling is that in and of itself is kind of on its own developmental path. There's been a focus on shifting resources. There's no question throughout the pandemic, certainly from a research perspective. But the other thing we need to be remembering is that, you know, there are some technological elements or domains that will grow and develop at a rate different to other areas as well. I'll give you an example. Some of the constraints in developing a vaccine, for example, are the timeframes associated with having vaccines registered with the relative authorities in each country, the drug agencies, if that makes sense. Now, there's very good reasons for doing that. It's so that we don't chuck out a half-assed product and kill people, because we've done that before. So there are structural constraints that over time will modify and through technology, I suspect, be able to make shorter as well. So that process, I think, is on its own track. There might be a blip in it, and of course there's micro blips in all these curves. Whether or not it goes too far off the pathway that it's taking or not, I would be surprised. That's just a personal opinion, and that's from hanging out in a number of technologically complex environments and listening to the scientists that are working in there. Many PM jobs, ads are written in a way they expect the PM to have all the answers and need to be technical experts in the solution. They do not allow for mistakes or PMs to be wrong. How do we change this perception? Well, that's an excellent question as well. I think as a professional association and a body that you are, I think you are the custodians of what your professional capabilities, competencies, and contributions are. And I think a lot of the time it's about educating people as to what is valuable, what is important, and what adds value to their organisation. And remember that if I'm recruiting for a role, I want the perfect human being. And so I'll write the job description for the perfect human being. Do I really expect that I'm going to get that person? No, of course not, because they don't exist. And in fact, that's another conversation that we could have at another time. This notion of pathological perfectionism. You know, perfectionism still gets rewarded in organisations, and yet it is a incredibly destructive form of anxiety that is rewarded and strengthened in organisations, and leads to that growing, broader sense of cultural anxiety that's starting to emerge. So yes, we're not going to get the perfect person in the role. If I'm recruiting, and I have been an HR director in the past, and I have recruited for senior roles, if I was constrained to two factors for any role in the organisation, it was always openness and readiness to change. So if I am working with somebody who's from a psychological perspective, and openness is a very specific personality factor, it relates to the ability to be able to take on board another person's view, or be open to differing perspectives, be open to seeing the wrongness in my perspective and changing that, all of those sorts of factors. If I can have high levels of that in an individual, and if I can have high levels of readiness to grow and learn and develop, they're the two factors that make the most difference. So if you're recruiting for project managers, I'd be looking for those two things, first and foremost. How will our next generation perceive new normal lessons learned to counter these situations should they occur in the future? That's a great question. Wow, that's a big question too, as I think about it. I have to change my seat. I have to get a more comfortable couch here. Humans tend not to learn very well, you know. Humans tend to get out the back of really horrific experiences and go, "Phew, we dodged a bullet there," and they get back to normal life fairly quickly. And I jokingly say to my colleagues, I'm not sure whether we've been in lockdown for long enough for us to get the learning yet, because I don't know whether we've experienced enough pain to not go back to the old world. Now, I think we're at the cusp around that. What we're seeing in organisations are people saying, we do not want to go back to the way we worked before. We don't want to go back to the same structure. I've demonstrated that I can work 3 days a week at home and just come in for 2 days a week. I want to keep that going. And what I'm hearing is more and more organisations are willing to do that and are embracing that and are running with it. So I think we've got enough momentum to maintain the change, if you like, and refine the emergency model into a really nice blended model that's more sustainable and more healthy for our individuals in organisations. Hope that answers that question. Heightened focus on crisis management skills for leaders. Yeah, look, it's a really tough one. I've spent majority of my life volunteering as a surf lifesaver, for example, and been in crisis situations many, many times, like life or death crisis situations. There is an enormous amount of habituated practice that needs to go into responding to those situations. And there's not a lot of time in a leadership growth curriculum to condition myself to the degree that I need to be able to execute in a crisis perfectly. So the answer to the question is, I think we need to be aware of how we ourselves respond in crisis situations. I think we need to, as leaders, understand how we cope with acute anxiety and stress. And I think we ourselves need to devise our own ways and our own practices and our own habits to start to grow ourselves in those spaces so that we can execute more effectively in those situations. And that is a very personal thing. There is not a magic bullet for that sort of stuff. So hence that notion of introspection.
Maybe those remaining two questions there.
Yeah, so where are we up to?
Do you think there should be a heightened focus? Oh, is that the one on having crisis management skills for leaders?
Oh, yeah, there's just one more before that. What executives see as the future of work as traditional career ladder is becoming less applicable. Yeah, so certainly the future of work, that is a massively ballooning area at the moment in terms of understanding that. There's no question that the traditional professions will be the last to change in that. So for example, medicine, engineering, sciences, accounting, law, they still maintain and hang on to their career pathways. Even they are discovering that they are under stress at the moment. Careers 20, 30 years in the future will be far less stable, less predictable, less linear. We will have more of them. I'm one of the first of the Generation X's. I've already had 7 distinct careers in my life. I'm in my early 50s. I expect to have another 3 or 4 careers because my life expectancy is at least 100 plus now. So I'm only mid-career, if that makes sense. So starting to change our headspace around our longevity and what it means to live 100 plus years and what that means in terms of the way you spend your time and how that lines up with traditional career paths, it doesn't. So we need to be much more flexible about how we even relate to organisations in terms of employee versus employer. Even that is up for grabs at the moment and changing. So it can be disconcerting, but the opportunity lies in the disruption at the moment. So sitting with the anxiety of the disruption is a very sensible thing to be doing. Agile PM, one methodology to be followed post-pandemic, adjusting the project goals based on the need of the hour is a key fundamental notion of agile methodology. Absolutely. And how do you do that without chucking out the end point and getting too distracted and going too far off the critical path and getting preoccupied by nodes which some people think are, critical nodes and others see are termination nodes. These are all really interesting challenges because the way that we see the world and the way we see what we're doing and what's important can be very variable. As I was saying before, what you see is not what I see. So this notion of collaborative project management, I think, I don't even know whether that's a term, but I can see that becoming much more important and our roles starting to be much more fluid. I think I've got all those questions.
Can I just, Travis, thank you. Can I just finish up with a general question? We had a presentation from one of our Adelaide Connected events last year, the year before, in fact, and we had a consultant that does a lot of work interstate also present on the panel. And one of the comments I recall her saying was that we are in Adelaide or South Australia a little behind in some of the I suppose the thinking, the thought leadership, the management styles than the eastern states. You obviously consult to many corporates. How do you find? I mean, it sounds like living here in Adelaide and SA has been great from a avoiding the pandemic and being able to cope well. How have our businesses and our organisations that you're across, how we compare with interstate?
Yeah, I think I would probably just make a more refined observation. Behind, I'm not sure. I think there are some elements about being in a smaller commercial environment that lend themselves to perhaps getting a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more complacent and a little bit more probably taking things for granted potentially. So the propensity to want to continue to grow and stretch and push the boundaries and disrupt, arguably the impetus to disrupt is not as intense as what it might be in a more globalized commercial environment like you would expect in Sydney, for example, or Singapore. Now, that's infinitely questionable now because as a result of the pandemic, we can do a lot of what we do here in Adelaide and contribute anywhere in any organisation, anywhere in the world. So I think we need to be really stretching our thinking and challenging ourselves to not limit ourselves in terms of what we do, even as project managers to be tied to one geography, because clearly we can manage projects remotely in very different environments, in very different cultures, based on a very different paradigm about how we work. So I would challenge us to stretch ourselves in that regard a little bit.
Cool. And what's your views? Personally, are you looking forward to the 3-2, sort of 3 days interstate again, or are you happy working from home?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think even my behaviour will change. I tend to want to jump on the plane and get together face to face with people, but even my clients now are much more content with having that be infrequent rather than all the time. So I'll be using that to spend a little bit more time at home and less time travelling, and hopefully a little bit more time on my own well-being and my own balance.
Fantastic. Thank you, Travis. I appreciate that. If we're obviously there in person, we'd obviously I'd ask the audience to say thanks and through an applause. But obviously it'll be a virtual thank you. If I can just wrap up, I've just got our slides. Just go back to our slides and oops, not the one. Okay, where are we? Everybody see that?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, I'll just go. Okay, so we've had ample time for questions and answers. Again, thank you, Travis, for sharing that very insightful presentation and obviously leaving a bit of food for thoughts and some further questions for us to ponder. Just a quick question again, was there any, your slides, are they available? Well, we've obviously got them recorded, so
yeah, of course,
will they be available on our site?
Yep, no worries at all.
And again, thank you, Travis, and on behalf of the of our chapter, we do have a nice little bottle of wine. It's not from the one of our vintages, but I will bring it across. I'm not sure if I've shared my screen. I think I do. I'll drop that off shortly.
Thank you very much.
Your front porch.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Send you just a digital certificate thanking you for your very insightful presentation tonight. Can I also thank the team behind this event? There's always a number of people that make these events possible. Grace, Kushal, Kamyar and Scott in particular, and I'm sure there's the team behind the marketing, comms and social media team. So thank you once again. And just a quick note, we're all volunteers. What I did also overlook saying when introducing Travis was he's obviously a serial volunteer also, having volunteered with the Surf Life Rescue Club for 20 odd years, and I think he's still got time to look at volunteering with the CFS, the local CFS here. So I don't know where he gets his time from, but well managed. So if there is any of you out there that are looking to get involved, share some of your time with the chapter, whether it's in presenting or supporting in these events. If you could share your feedback through that link there, marketing@pmiadelaide.org. And we're also going to be following up with a short survey following this event. If you could just take a minute to provide some answers to 4 or 5 questions that would help us plan for subsequent events. And again, thank you all for your time tonight, and hopefully you've got some key tips that you can actually consider and take back to your workplaces, and hope to be getting back to a face-to-face event in the not too distant future. So once again, on behalf of the Adelaide chapter, stay safe. I think Travis also mentioned connectivity, stay connected, and again, look forward to seeing you all in person in the near future. Thanks again, everybody. Good night.
See ya.
Thank you, Peter and Travis.
Good night. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Travis, and everyone. Have a good night.
You too.